recording on our computer. Here we go. Thank you all, panelists and attendees and interpreters. Thank you so much, and welcome to the Transforming Abusive Behaviors panel hosted by Women's Advocates. Again, my name is Mary Beth. I am the Community Education and Outreach Manager at Women's Advocates and your moderator for today's panel. I am so excited. I've been planning this panel for months. I've been geeking out about it. I'm so excited to have Scott, Laura, and Amirthini here today. We have a whole lot in store for you, so let's get started. Just briefly, Women's Advocates, who we are, why you're here. We are a nonprofit organization in St. Paul, offering a continuum of safety through prevention programming, like these webinars and panels, emergency shelter and advocacy services, and housing stability for victim survivors of domestic violence. We began as a legal advice helpline in 1972, expanded to provide shelter starting in 1974, and now we're 3 connected homes that work to walk with victim survivors and our community to break the cycle of domestic violence. You can learn more about us at the website on the at the bottom of this slide. And Women's Advocates is located on Dakota land. The area that's now St. Paul was stolen from the Dakota people by the American government through centuries of wars, broken treaties, and acts of cultural genocide. Through incredible perseverance and resistance, the Dakota are still here and strong. Native women and girls face the highest risk of domestic violence, sexual assault, and intimate partner homicide. We express our gratitude for the Indigenous-led organizations who are working every day towards a world without domestic and sexual violence. And as an organization, Women's Advocates commits ourselves to supporting tribal sovereignty with the same fervor that we support the self-sovereignty of victim survivors. And with that, let's get started, shall we? We have 4 themes for our panelists to discuss today. We're going to start with understanding accountability and justice, what it looks like today, talking about promoting change, how batterer intervention and abuse intervention programs work. Then we'll move into restorative justice and domestic violence. Like, how do those things work together? And we'll close out today by talking about what we can all do to shift the culture towards accountability and transformation for people using abuse. Some quick reminders, again, put your questions and comments in the chat or in the Q&A box. I will get you an email with the slides and a certificate and a recording of this panel later today, so don't you worry about that. You'll see that in your inbox later. But let's get started. Before we introduce the panelists, I want us to all hear from each other. What are you doing in the community? What's your profession? What's your community role? And real quick, why was it important to you to attend this panel today? I know we've got advocates from all over the country, from tribal nations, from state governments, from all over the place. And I am just wondering, like, what brought you here? So please answer that in the chat if you can. And while you're doing that, I want to take a moment to discuss why at Women's Advocates we thought it was important to host this conversation. Firstly, because the focus on victim survivors that we do at Women's Advocates on sheltering people from abuse is really important. But we all know that, like, sheltering people from abusive situations doesn't make the abuse stop or go away. It just protects that person. Really, the ones with the true power, the people with the true power to end domestic violence are the people who are enacting it, are the people who are using abusive behaviors. Those are the people with the power to end abuse. But we also know that simply turning abusers over to law enforcement doesn't mean they're going to stop. And it often puts them in danger of police brutality, which nobody should ever experience, regardless of what they've done. So I wanted to bring these 3 experts into the room today to talk about how we can reconcile abusive behaviors and the need for transformation and accountability from abusers with the rising movement to end incarceration and end imprisonment. I'm not expecting us to find an answer in these 90 minutes or leave with like a 5-point plan for abolishing prisons. I have no expectation that we're going to get that done today. But I want us to imagine what we can do to create a culture that holds abusive people accountable to the harm that they've caused and to the transformation that they need to make, so that we make domestic violence a thing of the past without disappearing more of our neighbors. Thank you all for including comments in the chat. And we'll first start with meeting our panelists. First up, we have Amirthini Keefe, who is the Executive Director of the Domestic Abuse Project in Minneapolis. The Domestic Abuse Project provides advocacy, case management, and therapy services for every member of the family. Amirthini is a licensed independent clinical social worker with over 19 years of experience working with trauma survivors, including youth homelessness, foster care and adoption, veteran homelessness, torture treatment for asylum seekers, and domestic violence. Amirthini has a passion for social justice and advocacy. Her leadership has focused on providing trauma-informed, equitable, and anti-racist services to all members of the family struggling with domestic violence. Amirthini, welcome. Thanks for coming. Why was it important for you to be here today?
Yeah, I think, the crux of our work at DAP is to work with everyone in the family. And we believe that working with folks that use harm is just as important as working with victim survivors and ending the intergenerational cycle of violence. So if we really want to end this issue that we're all really committed to, going to the root of the issue and working with folks that are causing harm is just vital to our work. That's why I'm here.
Well, thanks for being here. Next up, we have Laura Gapsky, who is the Director of Restorative Programs at Men as Peacemakers. She's also got over 19 years of experience working with women and children, supporting survivors in the fight to end domestic violence. As Director of Restorative Programs, Laura is designated to empower and take the lead in shaping an inclusive, holistic, and innovative staffing and programmatic leadership plan. She's a contract employee with First Witness Child Advocacy Center and North Star Family Advocacy Center, served as the co-chair of the St. Louis County Mortality Review Committee for Child Protection Services while working as the program director at First Witness. She's a forensic interviewer, a national trainer, expert witness, and consultation for child abuse maltreatment professionals through her LLC, LG Principles Expert Witness and Consulting. Laura has worked at domestic abuse intervention programs as the coordinated community response coordinator, where she facilitated nonviolence groups with women who were court ordered for their use of resistive violence against their partners. She's got over 6 years of experience working with men who use violence towards a life of nonviolence. And Laura, welcome. So glad to have you. Why was it important for you and Men as Peacemakers to be here today?
Yeah, Men as Peacemakers has a nationally rare program where we are working with the highest level domestic violence offenders, people that are on dispositional departures from prison. And so we are really their last line to move away from the incarceration or justice system involved approach to ending violence. And so I'm very proud of the work that I do in restorative practices. And we're really trying to move from restorative to transformational, as you've talked about, practices where we're not so embedded in the criminal justice system. Because we know a punitive approach is not always the most effective or the best outcome for survivors or the offenders. And so that's why I'm here today. And thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being here. And finally, we have Scott Miller, who works at the Domestic Abuse Intervention Programs. You may recognize them as the home of the Duluth model, where that power and control wheel comes from. Scott Miller has been working in the women's movement since 1985, has worked for the Domestic Abuse Intervention Program since 2000, and serves as both system advocate and coordinator of the Men's Nonviolence Program. He's instrumental in the evolving work being done in Duluth. Scott trains nationally and internationally on the components of the Duluth model of intervention and helps develop new resource materials for use in communities working to end violence against women. Scott has also co-authored the Domestic Abuse Intervention Program's nonviolence curriculum called Creating a Process of Change for Men Who Batter. He works independently as an expert witness in criminal and civil trials to explain how the tactics of abusers and the associated risks generated by battering are linked to the counterintuitive behaviors of victims. And Scott just got off of another webinar, so we're very pleased that he could make time for us today. Thanks for being here, Scott. And why was it important for you to go straight from that webinar to this one?
Well, first off, Amirthini and Laura are on this one. So, anytime I get a chance to be in conversation with either of them, I'm on. No, this is a great conversation, and it's an emerging one, and it's an evolving one. And I think we have a lot of ideas about the direction of this conversation. I don't think we've figured out a lot of the solutions yet. So it's nice to be on the it's the front end of a kind of a different way of thinking about this, but certainly at its beginning. Yeah, it's good to be here. So good.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for being here today. I'm personally thrilled. I've been thinking about this for a long time now. I know you got your first email from me in July probably about this. So thank you all for waiting and for being here.
It's easy to say yes to something in July when it's happening. Asked me a week ago and I might have said, well, I don't know.
That's how we get you early. We do a lot of pre-planning so we can catch you early before those schedules fill up. But thank you all for being here. We are going to move to our first theme for these next 15 or so minutes, which is understanding accountability and justice. And before we ask our panelists questions, I want to posit a question to the attendees who are here working in programs with victim survivors or domestic violence in general. Does your organization or program directly address people who use abuse in their relationships, and how? I can say for women's advocates, we specifically work with victim survivors of domestic violence. We don't have any specific programming dedicated to transformation or restoration, any of that. We are focused solely on survivors. So I want to hear from folks who are in this webinar today. Are you all addressing people who are using abusive behaviors or people who are abusing their partners, and how? But while you're doing that, just providing some context that no two abusive relationships are exactly the same. Every victim survivor has different needs and wants regarding their path to justice. Some victim survivors call 911 during an incident, other people don't. Some prefer to try and fix or end their relationship without outside assistance, and some people go through the courts. Some abusers get incarcerated and some abusers avoid charges. There are so many different paths that are available to folks who are experiencing abuse. And so we're going to talk today, what are all the different paths to justice and accountability for survivors and accountability for those using abuse, and where do those different paths lead? Let's see, looking at the chat, we have some folks who are remanded only to work with victim survivors and their dependents rather than abusers, but a couple of folks who are working at places with intervention programs for abusers. So that's great. We've got a good mix here. Okay, panelists, let's get on to our first question. What does justice mean to the victim survivors that you're working with? And what does accountability mean to the people you work with who have used abuse? Who wants to take it away?
Who's going to draw the short straw in this one?
I can jump in and say that I think, we recently did listening sessions with victim survivors. And I think one of the themes that we heard was, at a core issue, justice is really being believed that their experience happened to them, that they were harmed, and having folks take the time to listen to them and to acknowledge their experiences. I think justice is also putting things in place to ensure that they're not harmed again and that other people aren't harmed by the person that's hurt them. So I think that's how I would answer that question. I think accountability, and I'm going to actually think about this from a victim survivor's perspective, again, from the voices of the folks that we talked with. I think part of it is, I was expecting folks to want the folks that had hurt them to suffer, right? We think that that's part of what victims would be wanting. And depending on where you are in your journey, that might be an initial reaction or something that people hold for a period of time. But what we heard most often was that they wanted healing for the person that hurt them, because that's what they felt was necessary in order for them to stop hurting other people in the future. And so I think accountability is having somebody engage in a healing process. It's having the victim's experience acknowledged by the person that harmed them. And I think it's thinking about how we as a community also need to be accountable, not just the individual that's caused harm, but as a community, how are we supporting the person that's engaged in harm, and how are we changing the way that we look at domestic violence and what victims experience.
I want to thank you for bringing that perspective. I mean, part of Scott Miller has been a mentor of mine. We've done groups together with men, and I've learned so much from him. And one of the most important things was bringing that lived experience to inform up rather than that top-down approach. It's not an academic approach. It's really listening to the experts, and that is the folks that have experienced that violence and have been involved with these systems. So thank you for bringing that to light. For our program, for my interactions with victim survivors, it's giving them decisions or giving them options, right? So many times, I actually just did a circle last night with a family, and the survivor said, I was forced to do by the court system. I was the victim and I had to do these domestic violence classes. Like, in the end, she had some appreciation for it, but she felt like she was being punished for being a victim of that situation. And so giving survivors and victims options to be able to have some control given back to them and taking control of their lives, we need the court system to listen to that. There is a time and place where I understand safety is concerned, but who better knows what is safest for them than themselves?
Yeah, and I, just to really echo what has been said already, is they want to know that justice for them is that they don't have to be the one to face the threat alone. That there's somebody beside them that is not only is with them, but also believes them. And I think that this notion of listening to women's voices is, it's been on bumper stickers since the 70s, right? But it's still this overwhelmingly radical idea, because so many places that I go, and they say, we're trying to figure out how to develop our response here to domestic assault, but we're not sure where we should start. And they said, so what do you have that? Well, I have all kinds of examples, but I haven't talked to the women in your community. I don't know what they're saying. What's their agenda for change? What's their experience? Because that's going to inform everything you do. Right? If you want to know what your agenda is, start doing some focus groups, right? And listen to what women are saying. They will give you years of work to do, right? So, how you use that, we can talk about that, but that's really foundational. Any kind of change process is just listening to women. And then your second bullet there, unlike Amirthini, I'm going to take this one on as it's written. because it's an interesting, I don't know, what does accountability mean to people who we work with who have used abuse? What accountability means to them is typically they're coerced. They are forced into a program they don't want to be in, that they would not volunteer in. So now, just to put a little context to that, Ed Gondolf, who's done tons of research in this field, has shown that coerced treatment is more effective than treatment with no leverage or no coercion to get them in for this particular population, right? Because they wouldn't sign up for it. There has to be some incentive. There has to be some leverage to get them in. So typically, how the men are talking about it on the front end is that I have to do this. But after being in the program a while, you know, if the pastor's the one telling him he has to go, if it's the judge telling him he has to go, like whoever in the community is telling him he has to go, that can't be how we replicate that in our transformational space. To Laura's point, we don't, I mean, Paulo Freire, a Brazilian educator that we kind of base our process on, you know, his idea of traditional education is domesticating people. And if I go in as a facilitator and start telling men how to live their lives, then I'm doing to him what he does to her. And I just replicate the same abusive tactic. So starting with where the men are at, and you know, as the men have said in our focus groups, because we do focus groups with the men in our groups too, to find out what works and what doesn't, get us talking about our lives. Help us understand the life that we're living, right? Put it before us so that we can make critical decisions about where our lives are taking us, right? And see it from a larger scope or a larger lens. And so accountability ultimately is what he decides to do for himself. Be responsible for the decisions that he's made, and also the path that he's on, and which path does he want to walk down. And he literally has a choice, right? I mean, I can't make him go anywhere, right? So we provide the option. They make the decision about what kind of life, and then that's the personal account. That's real change, right? When somebody can hold themselves accountable for what they've done and then make decisions going forward. So, yeah, that's.
Well, thank you all. I think I'm seeing more and more a focus on, just like you said, choice. The one of the principles of trauma-informed care, which we're really big on at Women's Advocates, is like the people we're working with are the experts on what they've been through, whether that is victim survivors or the people who have abused them. And we don't reserve trauma-informed care. We don't reserve self-sovereignty for specific populations. It is a choice to take accountability or not. It's a choice to pursue safety or not if you are able. But what routes are currently available for victim survivors of domestic violence to seek justice inside the police and judicial and carceral systems, and then maybe outside of the systems after that? How do people get justice?
Ooh, that's a big question.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, who wants to take that one?
Well, I'll start here. How about this? Inside a criminal system, for example, really that system is designed. It's the criminal justice system. It's not the victim justice system. So all the rights associated in that process are to the accused. And so the only way that she gets a voice in that process is possibly at sentencing, But on the front end, it's really what she tells the law enforcement officer. That report that officer writes really stands in for her through the whole process. So if that report is a good one, and that officer's been given the tools to know how to talk to a survivor, gather the right kind of evidence, help paint a picture for those making decisions in the system to see the experience that she's having. If that's being done, then that can be a powerful testimony into that space. But if it's a probable cause report where the officer goes in and simply probable cause is a police officer's burden of proof to make an arrest, if that's the burden that they're operating from rather than beyond a reasonable doubt, then the minute they find probable cause for an arrest, they just end their investigation and take people in, and her voice is really removed. I mean, I've read police reports where the victim's name wasn't even in the report. So she's been basically erased from the process. So that's one of the things that drive victims away from that system when it's not designed to take up the problem she has or the solution she's looking for.
Yeah, I just want to keep running with that. I think, as you said, the police report is such a pivotal tool in the process. And if a victim isn't believed, which we know happens often, or if the report doesn't contain all the information that is required for an attorney to determine that, yep, we're going to actually charge somebody, or if the victim isn't in a place to actually convey the information because they're in the middle of a trauma response, right? So details are hard, timelines are hard. Speaking might be hard, seeing might be hard, depending on the type of injuries that they have. And so it might just be difficult to also gather enough information or good information if the officer's doing a great job because the victim is struggling, understandably so, because they just were traumatized. So there's all these factors that make it complicated and make it difficult for, I think, justice to be served in those systems. And that's if folks even get to the point of calling the police because they feel like that's a safe option for them, which for lots of communities, it's not or hasn't historically been.
Right.
I got a call the other day from somebody who was witnessing an act of domestic and was like, is there anybody that I can call that's not the police? And I had to say, I mean, you're in St. Paul? Not right now, no. That option just doesn't exist right now. Or if it does, I don't know about it, in which case somebody please tell me that option exists. But Laura, I think I cut you off.
No, I was just going to mention, tacking on again, of our Indigenous community. We have a very large, tribal representation here, and tribal folks that are definitely, especially if they have children, concerned about calling law enforcement. And so we are very lucky to have technical assistance that is for tribal nations here in Duluth as well. And they've in the past been in a partnership with DEIP, but we need to be mindful again of the historic trauma that has been caused of removing children. And so again, we've needed to train. Part of my work at DEIP was working with Scott Miller about what does this look like for domestic violence with the child protection system? Because that's another form of justice, is not having their children removed because they're unable to remove an offender from their home. How do we teach trauma-informed approach for DV victims with CPS, not just the criminal justice system? But that is another way, again, that survivors are not being served justice, is by having their children removed from their home because of the perception that they're unable to protect their children. So that's been another route that we haven't necessarily brought up, but accountability means if it doesn't go through the criminal justice system, there's still going to be a social services case open if there's minor children in the home, because they have to co-report that. So what can justice look like from a CPS perspective? And part of the work that DEIP has done is incorporated social services into that CCR coordinated community response, because that is another thing that keeps survivors from coming forward, is the concern about losing their children. And in doing men's groups and working with men who use violence, we know that is common a threat, especially if she's coping with drug or alcohol addictions. That is a concern that they will report her as a retaliation of using the justice system against a survivor.
And just to give you a little bit of an insight, what a trauma-informed response might look like if somebody is called the system for help, right? And this is really hard to break into a policy or a protocol, because it's really an approach, right? And so this is body cam footage from a local police department, and this woman has experienced a domestic assault. The house is just in shambles, the door's off the hinges. And a young rookie officer comes in and, basically, ma'am, what happened here? And she just says, my vase is broken and my table's upside down. And she's trying to straighten up, and she's embarrassed and she's ashamed, and all of the stuff that happens in that space, right? And he just keeps trying to get her to tell him what happened. A more experienced officer comes in and said, ma'am, where's your vacuum? And she said, it's in the closet. And so he goes in the closet and gets the vacuum out, and there's glass on the floor. And so they start picking up the glass and vacuuming it up, and she's straightening things. And then he gets the officer to help put the door back on the hinges and gets the door fixed and all that. And when the space is now orderly to where the woman's feeling comfortable, she sits down on the couch, and that officer sat next to her and he said, are you ready to talk about what happened? And she said, I think I am. Right? Now, that's meeting her where she's at, not where she has to be, because I've got a job to do, right? And that's the kind of thing that if that was common, if that was the response that everybody, we'd have a whole different, I think, way of thinking about entering into that system. But that's not, we're not there yet, right? And to your question about, like, who do you call? This is dangerous. This is one of the most dangerous things that officers go to. They get killed at the scene at domestic assault cases, right? Who's going, right? I mean, this is how we organize this. The only thing that I've had direct experience in Duluth around this is when we organize within the evangelical faith community. Their pastor had a lot of influence over the individual men. For those women, we're not calling the secular system, the secular community, and bringing them into our home. We're calling the pastor. That's our 911. But then the problem was, which I hear so much from people within a specific community, is that when I call somebody in my community, nobody helps either, right? So there's no help either way. So we had to work with pastors to know how to respond to this problem, the same way we work with the criminal justice system, because the problems were the same. Male-centered kind of responses in a heterosexual relationship, not listening to women, not acknowledging their experience. It was all the same stuff. So it was just in a different community, right? Different context. So the work is deep, right? And the problems just manifest in different ways in different systems, religious, cultural, government. It's all there.
Sorry, go for it, Mary.
Oh, I was gonna switch gears. So if you've got one more comment or point before we move to part 2, go for it.
Yes, I was going to say, when you were sharing that reframed narrative, gave me chills, Scott. And there's a poem I will try to find and put in the chat that's titled something like "If the Police Responded Like My Grandmother."
Oh, it's let's
which-
give the police departments to the grandmothers.
That's what it is.
Yes.
And it's beautiful. And it's exactly that, right? It's thinking about how you wrap somebody up in community and get them to a place of being able to take that next step, which is also giving them space for agency, right? It was just beautiful. And I wanted to just lift that poem up because it is a lovely poem and it's just such a different way of looking at things. But it also it's another way to also reinforce what it means to be accountable as a collective versus as individual people. So I just wanted to name that and appreciated the reframe.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Amirthini. And Brenison, hi, I see your question in the chat. How do we make it more conducive and supportive and beneficial for abusive individuals to choose to take accountability for their actions? We're going to get to that in part 3. So stay tuned. And yes, Laura, how does a community treat survivors and people who use violence? That's huge. We're going to get into part 2, which is promoting change. How do we go about treating, like, how do we treat people who use violence? How do we promote change? What options are available? But first, I want to launch a poll. What do we believe? This is the multiple choice poll. What do you believe about the ability of abusive people to change their behaviors? I'm very curious to see like what folks believe, and I'm going to give you a couple of moments to answer that question. But panelists, I'm wondering, when you tell people what you do for work, do they immediately start to talk about like what they believe, what people like? Do people start to tell you what they believe about abusive people?
No, they usually just decide that it's not interesting and want to talk about something else.
Yep, I'm gonna say.
If I want to
Exactly right.
end a social interaction, just bring up what I do. That's
Yep.
Fair enough.
yeah. So, what was the question again? Do they?
Do people respond when you tell them what you do? Do people respond by sharing what they believe about abusive people?
No,
But
what
if
they do is they
shut
share what
down,
they. It's about victims. If they have an opinion, it's about survivors, right?
Mhm.
really,
Like not all women are innocent, you know. Like
Mhm.
just-
it's always
Why
that.
don't
It's
they
like,
just
oh,
leave?
those women lie all the time.
Mhm.
And so I have to do the 2-pronged, like, not all domestic violence survivors are women, just the majority of them. And then also like, maybe we should believe people when they tell us that they've been harmed.
I did just have that happen though. I presented in a classroom yesterday. It's a social work introductory class, and they basically said, how can you do this work and not view the people who use violence as monsters? And that was a really great conversation to have about the challenge to myself starting out in this field, only working with survivors and victims, that I did only hear the negative, right? And they are oftentimes victims too, and society does not role model healthy relationships. It does not role model accountability. And so the circle I conducted even last night, I mean, the guy who used the violence was like, I just want to move past this. I'm tired of reliving this. And it's like, yeah, but you have impacted all of these people, right? And he's like, well, I've apologized. It's not an apology. Accountability is not just an apology. It might be one part of it, but it's so much more. And it's not just to the person you caused harm to, it's that ripple effect of all these family members. It was a family restorative circle, which was very powerful. A lot of tears.
Well, thank you for sharing, and thanks everybody for filling out that poll. I think we have most of our folks believing that taking accountability for abusive behaviors and changing behaviors is hard work, but it can be done. And another common theme was that if encouraged to take accountability, they can change. Abusive people are born not, or are made not born, rather than born not made. So thanks. And are we surprised by by any of these results? Let me
Well,
launch.
If
Yeah.
you look at most abusive people don't want to change their behavior, that's true. That's true.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't like the life that they don't like the consequences that come with it, but they're not raising their hand saying, I need a new life. Does anybody have one for me? That's not it, right? I mean, that's a true thing. I mean, it's our work to engage them in a process where they might be able to see options and other than what they have. I mean, I've said this for years. When I used to do orientations with guys, the first time they come into the program, I'd ask them, what do they want in their relationships? Typically, it's I want trust, I want commitment, I want loyalty. Sometimes they'd say love, but usually those first three. And so we put it on the board, and then we start talking to them about the things they're doing, usually around just yelling, right? What they would acknowledge. And then I go back to the thing. How is that going to get you this? I never had a guy say, I know how to make it work, right? I mean, they could see the disconnect between their behavior and what they wanted out of a relationship, but they literally did not know what it would look like to be in a different way.
Yeah.
It's about imagining a new life for yourself and a new way of being. And that can be really hard if you have lived your entire life believing that this is the only way to get what you want, that this is the only way to like have a good relationship. But question for you all, how do your respective organizations, and I know Laura and Scott have both spent some time at the AIP, but how do your organizations promote transformation and accountability for people who use abuse?
First and foremost, at Menace Peacemakers, we are in and of the community. This is a program that works along systems. We get referrals from systems partners, but we are run with community volunteers and then MAP staff. And so every week they're not necessarily meeting in our program with these systems folks. It's really perspective taking. It's about sharing. It's about being open and accountable to strangers that you build a relationship with. The beautiful thing about our transformational approach to this, although we are still in restorative by definition, is that those community members also walk away thinking about how they're living nonviolently, thinking about how they're being role models in our community, and having these transformational experiences in our circle. And so as each of those volunteers go out, they have different contacts, they have different communities that they are a part of, and the same thing with the men who are in our program. And so again, we really see how wide of a net we cast by bringing in diverse volunteers from all different backgrounds, walks of life, and communities.
I would say at our organization, I would drill it down to like everyday interactions with our participants. So we want to model that change because, as Scott and Laura both said, it's not that folks yes, folks don't want to actually engage in the change work because it would be great if things would just be magically different and you can go from one to the other because change work is hard work to do. And you have to be committed to doing it for the long haul to really hang on to that change.
Amirthini, can we all raise our hand to say that change work is hard to do?
Yeah, for real. For real. And hard for us as facilitators as well. I think part of the transformation process for us is that we have to do that work ourselves so that we can model it well with the folks that we're working with and own our own stuff when we don't, because we have days where we don't show up the best way. And that's all part of that relearning process of transformation for and accountability for our participants, is us modeling that as community members that are invested in them. And then it's, to me, little things. It's helping folks recognize the ways that we continue to affect harm and help folks lift that up and gain insight and practice around it. So like an example that's coming to mind for me is like talking with someone recently where they were like, I'm really holding myself accountable because I can say, and I'm telling people she was hurt and she experienced harm. And I was like, that's great, but where are you in that story, right? Because you're the one that actually hurt her and you're the person that that abused her. And so when you're going and telling everyone that this is what's happening in your family system, you need to make sure that you're acknowledging your part in that. And so helping our participants reframe the way that they're thinking about their partner while they're trying to build a skill of empathy and sympathy is another way that we really try to promote accountability.
And I'm just building on what both Laura and Amirthini have just said, because it's all, consistent with what, we're doing too. And the one thing I would add is that, what we try to do is find a way of making her visible in his head. One of the things that is really consistent with the guys that we work with is that they're the center of their lives, and she's kind of on the periphery, and they don't really know her. They don't pay attention to her. And so when he gives us his life, we as facilitators run it through the lens of what does that actually sound or look like to her? And then give it back to him as a question, give it back to him as a problem, give it back to him as a story, right? Something that helps him look at that situation from a different facet. So when the guy said, I never hit her. All I did was grab her by the hair and say, if we're not going to talk about this, right? So like in that moment, right, instead of talking to him about, well, why do you get to raise your fist? And why do you get to grab her by, kind of thing, help him see it from her end and say, when you had her by the hair and your fist was over her face, what did you want her to know? Right? I wanted her to know that we're not going to talk about this. Or what? And then all of a sudden, his mantra, I never hit her, I never hit her, I never hit her, kind of falls apart because the whole reason she stopped was because he threatened to hit her, right? But in his own mind, up until that moment, he had a whole different narrative in his head about that event, right? Until he was confronted with how this would look like through her eyes, right? So that really puts a lot, I think, of onus on the facilitators when you're working in a group with men to be deeply immersed in the experience that survivors have so that you can do that effectively in the room. And that really, in their heart, they will tell you they love her, right? Like, I love her. But then you should show all these examples where that love was the priority. The priority was getting what you wanted, right? So I'm not saying you don't love, but if you want to actualize the love, right? The guy in, I think it might even been Laura's and I group, where the guy said, I grabbed her by the lapels and I pinned her up against the wall. And I said, don't you fucking get it? I love you. And I backed myself to the wall and I said, pinned up against a wall doesn't feel like love. Do you see that? Like, he didn't, like, this is obvious to us, but it wasn't obvious to him, right? And those are those moments that I think, those epiphany moments where guys begin to see her for the first time. Man, I could get up every day for that moment.
Or they don't, because I just had this.
Or they don't.
On Monday. And this is a part of the process, right? It's a process that the men that go through our program don't end up being like, bell hooks feminists. Like, they are just not going there. But it is helping make those connections from others' perspectives. So on Monday in my circle, this man was talking about how he was a father. And I asked about, like, how were you there for your children? Well, I provided for them. I paid the bills, right? And I'm like, okay, so how much time
When's your kid's
did you spend
birthday?
in jail? Yeah. How much time did you spend in jail? And one of his stints out of the numerous was 20 months. And I was like, so how were you there for your children when you were in prison for 20 months? Like, let's just try to look at that other perspective. So it is very much slowly unfolding and bringing awareness of other perspectives to the men who use violence.
And so if the goal is not to indoctrinate abusive people into feminism, what is the goal of these abuse intervention programs? And and do they achieve that goal? Like I big fan of Lenny Bancroft. I lots of great work there about like what makes a good abuse intervention program. But my question is, do they work? What's the goal, and do most programs achieve them?
Yeah, I'll jump in and go for it, Laura.
Yes,
No,
please.
you go for it.
No, I'll yield.
Okay. I was going to say, I think like for us, an ultimate goal is ending intergenerational cycles of trauma, right? We want to not just stop violence with the people that are in front of us, but like everyone that comes after them. I think an immediate goal is harm reduction, and that's speaking to like the process, right? We only have at our organization 6 months with folks, which is like a drop in the bucket. You know, they're just starting to get to the good stuff, and it's time to go. They trust us. They feel like we're invested in them. They're really like moving from not wanting to engage in change at all and wanting things to magically shift to understanding what their role is. And our time is up. So what we see is folks moving from not re-entering carceral systems for physical violence, because that's usually what ends up in systems. But that doesn't necessarily mean that emotional, psychological violence has changed. That's really hard stuff to change. It's really subversive. And it requires a lot of intention and time and commitment to that change. That being said, we absolutely have seen generational changes over time with families that we've worked with. We've had folks come back to us that were children that came to our kids group and are talking to their kids about coming to DAP and what they experienced here and how life is different for them. And so we wouldn't be doing this work, I think, if we didn't believe it was possible. I think part of it's about the long game and thinking about what else we need to do as a community to evolve our work so that our change is longer lasting than we know it is right now.
Go ahead, Laura.
God. Thank you.
I've said go ahead, Laura, so many
Thank
times in my life that I can't.
Yeah, so I know for sure, like on DAIP, and I'll let Scott obviously talk about that, but as Peacemakers, we have been involved in a research project, and that's exactly what she's talking about is like, we only have funding for a certain amount of time, and then the men lose the structure and the folks that are having accountable conversations and role modeling healthy conversation, conflict, and views of women and men and what those relationships can really look like and love can look like. And so it is a part of that nonprofit industrial complex that says we have X amount of time to hurry up and change these people so that there's not a burden on the system. And that's the same thing with restorative practices or transformational. These see lifelong connection to community. But unfortunately, that's not always happening. Try to follow up as much as possible. Like it's really less important. It's not required anymore.
We're losing you, Laura.
Yeah, Laura, we're getting pretty staticky over here.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be getting better either. Yeah.
Oh no.
Why don't you shoot something to her in the chat, because I think that
Yeah,
I think she's
I'll
not hearing
send her
it
something.
either.
But
Well,
Scott,
here, I'll just
yeah,
jump
go
in
ahead.
while Laura's waiting for her internet to catch up. I think that well, now Laura's frozen up. I've actually forgot where the heck we are.
The goal
The goal.
of abuse intervention programs.
Right. Boy, it doesn't take much to get me off track. It's everything that Amirthini was talking about. It's everything Laura was talking about. I think the other piece to it is that we also want to we want to give men the language to name the nonviolent direction that they're going. One of the things that's always been fascinating to me is I had somebody in a training recently, and he said, you know, I was raised in a house where my dad was dominant, like we were talking about, and abusive to the family. He had and this is my role model for being a male. And he said, if I would have went into a world that would have had a very different idea of that, it would have been jarring to me. But instead, the world just basically colluded with everything my dad, identified as what a man is. Another guy in our group said, when I leave this room, I'm invited every day to be the guy who got me here. Right? The only space in my life. So when we think about change or the problem, I think we really need to get away from the notion of individual men, because it's seeing the depth of the problem that we're up against, right? So just like I said, no matter what system or community I'm looking at, they all have the same problem, right? They just do it in a different way, because that's how deep this social narrative, this is how efficient our culture teaches oppression, teaches people to have notions of privilege over others, right? And what we're doing is so counter to that the guys, well, this is the room that I do this in, and it doesn't work anywhere else, right? Because they can't even hardly imagine it, right? So when we get away from the idea of individual men, then we're working with, we'll work with about 350 guys a year. We're looking to give those men a narrative to go back into the world and actually put words to nonviolence, put words to equality, because they don't have them coming in. I mean, if we do equality logs on the board, it takes a long time because they don't have the language to put. But if I ask them to put it on the power and control web, man, they can lay that out easily. They've got the language web for violence is known, right? And so we're trying to change the culture of what we're in the community that we're living in the world that we live in, by. But then at the same time, I say that, right? I mean, DAP has got how many groups going a week with how many guys?
Yeah.
We got, and the guys say, this is the only spot in my whole life that I have this conversation. That's the problem.
Yeah.
They're not having it in the church. They're not having it in schools. They're not we're the only ones doing it. And that makes it really tough to change. Because that's what's producing the problem.
Yeah, and this goes to a future question of yours. But
Love that.
It's like thinking about thinking about addiction. If you take somebody who's struggling with use and they get clean, but then you put them right back in the environment that they were in, where everyone else around them is using, you can't expect them to stay clean, right? That's such a challenge. But yet that's what our participants experience every day. And so to bounce back between this question and your future question, I think part of our goal really is societal change around core beliefs that everyone has been conditioned to live under, that absolutely keeps violence alive and the use of violence alive. And we try to do that one person at a time, but we're drowning in it, because that's not the way to affect change. It's the way that we have learned how to do it and the way we're trying to do it, but we need it, but we need more than just that.
One thing that Men as Peacemakers does is have youth programming that is primarily focused on, these issues of conflict resolution, of social emotional skills, sexism, racism, equity, all of these topics with younger boys from 5th grade up to high school, and then working with young women in the high school too. And so these prevention programs are really a way to get at, that changing societal beliefs and society's views on what is a healthy relationship.
And here's because I'm turning 60 next week, so
Happy birthday, Scott.
that feels like a lot, but anyway, when I was young, when I was in college in the 80s, the gay lesbian group, because that's what they were called then, they couldn't even meet on campus. They met in a neighboring city in a private back room of a restaurant because was the only safe place they could gather, right? That's in the 1980s when I was in college. And my son, when he's in high school, there was an openly gay student, which again would be not something that would have ever happened in my high school. And it was a football game, and it was a moment for me to see my son, who was friends with him, run up and hug him in front of an entire football audience, at a game. And I thought, there's no way that would. I mean, so it's not like we're not changing the narrative. It's just excruciatingly slow.
It could
And
be
I'm
faster.
60, and I really wish it would speed up at this point. So.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about how to get us there. We've got about half an hour left in the panel. I think we did a good job of answering question 3 without me even asking it. I think the barrier we're facing right now is like there aren't enough of us, and it's a cultural problem that needs changing. But let's talk about restorative justice and how we do that in domestic violence circles. So just getting everybody on the same page regarding a definition, you can click the slides link to the Restorative Justice Exchange when you get these slides, but restorative justice is a response to wrongdoing that prioritizes repairing harm and maintaining positive relationships with others, because that is a core human need that the carceral system deprives people of. Restorative justice tries to address the root causes of crime rather than just put people away, even to the point of transforming unjust systems and structures. So what is the role, folks? I guess when we're thinking about like mandatory arrest laws and other procedures that kind of end up limiting survivors' options or discouraging them from seeking help in the first place, and also like knowing that most survivors don't want incarceration for their abusers, like they don't want punishment or pain for their abusers, they just want the abuse to stop. So that seems like a job for restorative justice rather than the carceral system, right? But what is the role of restorative justice in promoting healing and safety for victim survivors and accountability for people using abuse? Amirthini, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Yeah, I think when I think about this question, what came up for me was I think it provides victims or folks that have experienced harm options that have not been historically provided through mainstream organizations. And when we're thinking about the importance of agency, I think something I love about the restorative process is that as the victim moves through their journey of healing, I think what justice looks like and how it's defined and what they need also evolves. And I think moves beyond the individual person also into community. And so it just creates so much opportunity for healing and restoration that doesn't just focus on the one person that was harmed and the one person that experienced harm. So that's what came to mind for me.
And now I know, Amirthini, that you thought of the answers to these questions before we started. That's pretty impressive. Well, Laura, do you want to go before I give my kind of like, this is what I think works and this is what I think doesn't?
No, Mr. Miller, go ahead.
Well, okay, so we've been working on restorative justice for about 18 years in Duluth. I mean, it's been a long time, and it was a very difficult process 18 years ago when the domestic violence folks got together with mostly corrections folks who and some counselors who were pushing this idea of restorative justice. And the way that it was designed, we just thought it isn't, like so many things, it isn't designed for this problem. It has to be adapted in a way because you can't put a survivor in a circle with a with an offender when there's a power relationship piece there and there's fear and the violence hasn't stopped, and like it's not a safe space for her to be in. So we had this years of conversation trying to figure out, and there was no doubt, myself, other people on the DV end of the conversation, that there was a unique power that Amirthini was talking about in that circle that was hard to replicate in, say, in a men's group, right? But at the same time, and this is still a struggle, I think, for restorative justice as a mainline intervention, is capacity. We have 350 guys a year that need this programming, and it's really hard to find community that committed to have that many people volunteer to deal with that many. And the other piece too is that in our community, we have guys, if they're going to Laura's program, they're also coming to ours. And so it's interesting to talk to the guys about what they get from each. So like in our group, they're going to say, it's so helpful to sit with other men and listen to their stories and get onto my own when I'm slow to mind, but I can really pick up and learn from these other men and what they're saying. They don't get that in the restorative program. What they get there is an intimacy, a way to share a deeper experience than they would in a men's group, to get a deeper understanding of themselves. So, and there's actually some research out of Utah that shows that when you've got guys on a restorative program and a more of a group process, a men's program, that had the best result. One without the other, both had less than a favorable result than when they were doing both at the same time. So I just think we have to find a way to expand the capacity of that experience, because that's the limiting factor, I think, at this point.
Yeah, I think the role of restorative justice is building community and support around the victim survivor and around the person who's using violence, because we don't want that burden to be placed upon her to be his everything for social support, right? She's got her own healing to go through. She's worried about her safety. She's taking care of the children or the grandchildren. And in one of the circles that I'm doing right now, she's taken on that caretaking role. And so for her to give him, because there is safety and accountability, both in men's group and in the restorative process, she feels safe enough to say, hey, why don't you talk about this thing? And I'm like, yeah, okay. Like, she's willing to give him feedback because he's conveniently forgot about a lot of things or didn't realize it was abusive. And so that's been really powerful to have them bring in. And Scott's exactly right. In men's group, they get the benefit at DEIP of hearing other men's perspectives. But in restorative, in our program, we have many fewer guys. We serve 10 guys a year because it is such a labor intensive and community intensive process. And it's much slower. And so the guys do say, you know what, going and doing my prison time would have been a lot easier. So we, honestly, but they are committed through our screening process. We try to pull and accept people, because we do get many requests, only the folks that are actually committed to doing this work. And so again, it's community around both of them. And we actually do offer healing circles for the survivors as well, so that they can have a different kind of process that's also restorative for them. That is our research that Emily Gorder has done with the survivors that have used our program. They're more likely retrospectively to use the healing circle after their alleged offenders or partner circle is completed. Because at the same time, there were just barriers to being able to accept that help or being worried about maybe retaliation. And a lot of times the offenders are still telling because they haven't built that full truth yet, or trust rather, not to talk to us. Don't tell her, you know, because I will have contact with the survivors as well. And they're still trying to control that narrative of what she will or will not talk about.
And we should just let listeners know too, that when we organized this, we looked at the majority of our offenders were not ending up back in the system, civil or criminal, 8 years from the last point of contact. So we had we had a way of dealing with that problem in our community, but we also, when we did the analysis, found that about 20% of the guys were committing 50% of the reassaults. And so when we looked at that population, they weren't responding to what we had designed. So if we're gonna make something, as Laura said, as labor intensive as this, we don't want it for the guys that we're already having an impact on. We want it for the guys that are the most dangerous, the highest risk, which typically is not what restorative justice focuses on.
Right.
But what we're focused on because it's of its labor intensive nature. And this is a group of men that we're not reaching. And so what else can we add to their process to help, you know, unpack the problem? And so that people should just know that's how we've designed that here.
Thank you, Scott. Folks, as we work to end domestic violence and hopefully, ideally, end the systems of incarceration that disappear people, what from our communities and keep people isolated from one another, what are the barriers that are standing in our way? We've talked a little bit about some of them, but what are the barriers that you all see?
Yeah, I think time, resources, just, you know, continuing to run with the examples and the things that Scott and Laura have just talked about. You know, if we take a police officer that goes to a home and he goes 15 times to that same home, but every time he goes, he's only there for a short period of time. He has too many calls to go to, doesn't want to stop to take out the vacuum from the cabinet and help clean up that space to get a good report, a good reporting of what happened. Then we're investing all of our resources in the 15 visits versus 3 visits that are longer, right? So we need to think about how to reframe the resources we have to allow ourselves to slow down to do the work that really needs to be done. Same with restorative practice, like it takes a long time. And so folks, I think historically, we also haven't been able to do it because we have wait lists of 100 people trying to get in for this basic intervention. And so trying to do something like aftercare or trying to do restorative practice circles is really hard because you need to be really dedicated to it for an entire year with one person. But if we do that, we might never see that person again. If we don't, we might see them a couple years down the road, or we might hear about them in the news because they ended up hurting their victim to such a degree that now they're going to be incarcerated for 40 years, right? So being able to pool all of our knowledge that we have and really restructure the way that we do our work and have the time to do it with our participants is really important. I also want to say resources for the people that do this work. It's a really high burnout field. And folks do it because they love it and they see the impact, not because they get paid well to stay in the field. And as a field that has a lot of survivors that work in the field, that's just an added burden because they're healers that are still recovering from their own trauma and really need different types of support to last in the work.
Yeah, I had somebody, I was one of the participants there were 2 women at UMD who were MSWs, and they were doing a thesis on what Amirthini is talking about, the people in the helping fields and where they came from as far as their backgrounds and how the high percentage of people coming from abuse backgrounds that are in the helping fields. And one of the questions was to get, again, to what I think we're all talking about is, they said, well, what if when you were a child, talking about me, what would it, if social services, for example, would have intervened, which wouldn't have happened when I was in the 60s, but if they would have intervened at that time, could they have saved you? And I said, saved me? Like, I mean, you could have taken me out of the house so I wasn't experiencing the sexual abuse and the physical violence and the bullying at school and everything else that I experienced. But save me, the resource, right? So to Amirthini's point, I don't think our culture is ready to pay domestic violence workers what we're worth, much less pay a community to organize a way to actually, I mean, you sit in a forensic interview. Laura did that work, I did that work. You sit and you look at this girl at 5 years old talking about how her dad raped her. And who's going to talk to this girl 10 years from now when she's 15, right? I mean, we're dealing with the problem now, right? But what's the ongoing support for that person who's been sexually abused into their early teens, late teens, adulthood, right? I mean, it is I mean, we'd have to literally quit funding the military and move those funds back into healing. That's the hole we're in. And I know it's not hopeful. I always kind of feel like it's like, because I'm old again, I 10 Commandments movies in my head, right? So as he's walking across the sea and the sea has parted, in my mind, this is what it feels like. All that sea that's been parted, all the waves, all that water is like the pain, right? And what I need to do is find a way to keep that wall of water from drowning me, right? Because it's that overwhelming, that's that big. And I think we get lost sometimes fixing smaller problems and lose sight of how big this is and why we need to have conversations about how to expand this work, how to expand how we are thinking about community rather than pinning it on police to solve it, pinning it on the shelter to solve it, pinning it on a men's program to solve it. We can't do it alone, right? It's a lot deeper than that. And it's historical, right? I was with an indigenous tribe working with them, and they were telling me about their tradition before white contact. I said, but my people, white Europeans, I don't have a time I can go back to where we weren't colonizing. That is my lineage, right? So to get out of that lineage, I have to step out of my history and find a different way of thinking, right? This is how it goes.
Well, let's figure out how to do that. I mean, it's big work. We're doing big, we're recognizing that we have to do some big culture changing work here. We have to super decolonize, and we also have to do a lot
Super decolonize.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a lot of work to do here, and I would like to turn it in these couple minutes we have left to the attendees. Invite you to make a pledge today. What's one thing that you can do in your everyday life towards shifting our culture towards accountability and transformation? Hopefully these last couple questions from the panelists give you some ideas, but big fan. Minnesota is my adopted home state, so I've gotten really into Paul Wellstone lately. I'm very fond of yelling, "We all do better when we all do better" to people who cut me off in traffic. So I decided I would include that quote here. But couple questions for you all. Knowing that not everybody who wants or needs to change their abusive behaviors has access to intervention programming. It's up to all of us in the community to set positive examples. So if we know somebody who's using abusive behaviors or who we know has been abusive to past or current partners, what can we do or say to them to promote a change in behavior?
I mean, you guys jump in and correct me if you feel like there's a different way, but to me, I think we think it feels like rocket science, but it doesn't have to be that hard. It could just be going to that person and saying, hey, I care about you, and I just watched you totally degrade your partner at this party, and I want to help you. Like, I want to talk about that. This is how it made me feel. This is why I'm worried about you and your relationship. And I have a resource to share with you that might be a good place for you to go. But I think part of it is us not always focusing on the victim and their experience, and having conversations with victims about what they're experiencing versus going to the person that's causing harm and having that uncomfortable conversation with them. I think we privilege talking to a victim and then therefore judging victims that choose to stay, instead of doing the work of going directly to the person that's harming. I think both are really important. I think we just don't do the 50% of that conversation. And it's being honest and direct, and committed to gutting it out with that person, because they're going to flip you off maybe at first, right? Who wants to hear feedback about how you're engaging in a relationship with someone that's not good?
Right.
Yeah, I want to echo the danger of, because early on in my work, I've made a lot of mistakes and I've had to learn from those. And I have a lot of regrets, but you learn from what you've done. And so going up to someone in public and talking with them may be dangerous for them later, trying to help the survivor in front of the offender is not a good idea. Gauge the situation, ask her what she's comfortable with, if you plan to give her those resources. Oh, I love that video. Oh, that's not a video, that's Instagram. There's a video that I'd like to send too, if that's not the same one in the chat. Sorry, I got distracted. But I think, letting people know that behavior is not acceptable and that there's help for them. I don't know what your background is. I don't know, how you've dealt with conflict in the past, but there are services that you can voluntarily get involved with. And I think that's a part of it too, is those folks that are not justice system involved. What are we doing for those folks, right? With those folks that use violence that we all know in your social scene or in your friends or extended community that might be people that are using different tactics of violence. And so how do we provide those services for folks that, again, are only funded a lot of times? We can't just take someone off the street. I'm doing a family restorative circle right now, and there was past criminal justice, but they're not court ordered, but we're not necessarily funded for that. And I'm just doing that because that's important to our community, right? And they were all willing to participate in that. And it takes more of that. And this was a family member that was like, no, we need to have a family conversation about the harm that's been caused. So many folks are not willing to do that. And he was not the person that used the violence. He told me straight up, he's like, I don't want to be here. And I was like, you are so brave. I am proud of you for being here. I don't imagine this is easy for you, but this shows your commitment and your love for your family and your partner to be here tonight voluntarily.
And I would just say, you have to understand. I mean, if somebody's being abusive, it doesn't mean they're being a batterer, right? It doesn't mean they're oppressing somebody. But if you've got somebody who's actually actively oppressing their partner, beating them into submission, that is a tough conversation. I mean, it's tough we spent 6 months with them in group, and that's a tough conversation, right? And they don't see it. Part of being privileged is to feel like a victim of other people's choices. There's even psychological research that shows that men who batter are far more likely to interpret their partner's decisions as counter to their best interests. I mean, this is the mindset, right? And so as you talk to them about what you see, they don't see that. What they see is a defective person who's causing them problems, that they're entitled to things that she's not giving them, and that's actually harming him. That's making him feel like a victim. So unless you know that stuff, I mean, if you've got a tight relationship with somebody, I mean, I'm not men who batter, but just in general, the notion that women are less than, or one of the most effective ways that I go about being in that space is just being me. And I don't, with other men, and I don't know, just speaking to, men can get a lot of things done without talking. There's just this man space thing that happens, and there's an energy that other men feel like it is just what was just said is not landing, and because of who's in the room. And I've actually watched guys start to talk differently because of that almost, for the most part, unspoken kind of energy that I put out in that space. That it's just, I don't participate in that without embarrassing them, without kind of pointing a finger at them, but just, it's not okay. I'm not in it. And because they respect me, there's a way to influence that space. But I think with men who batter, that's a tough one.
I'll make one comment. The men in our circle, I've seen them cry when I say, you are a part of our organization. You are working towards being a peacemaker. And they don't realize that. They view themselves as getting services. No, you are a part of this organization in this movement. And that's a way that, again, I'm not alienating. You're not an other, you're not a pity, project or something. You are a human being, and we welcome you in here. You are part of our movement.
So how do we bring that movement out into the world? What do we do? I mean, we all probably know somebody whose behavior we want to unpack a little bit more, but on a cultural level, like what can we do as individuals to bring about this culture change that we are all desperately begging for and seeking, one that doesn't excuse abusive behaviors but doesn't alienate people from their communities?
Yeah, we talk about humanizing harm doers and the fact that all of us have the capacity to harm. And it's about the choices that we make that lead to one decision or the other. And if we humanize folks that use harm, then we can have more openness to the idea that everybody also deserves healing, right? And I would say the same for victims as well. I think that there's a different way that we categorize victims that sometimes makes it hard to stay in it with folks while they're navigating what they want to do and where they are in their relationships.
Scott, any advice?
Well, and all these things sound small in comparison to the problem, but they all help, right? Vote for people who want to fund solutions. Vote for people who fund solutions, please.
Everybody
right?
register to vote.
Yeah.
And Laura Gapsky is one of them.
I am running for a state assembly in Wisconsin, and we have a multiple $billion surplus. Let's think about those funds going to our community organizations. That is where that fund needs to go.
Yeah.
I wasn't pandering there, Laura. I didn't even put that together until right at the end.
And I would say, like, invest in your DV organization. Like, people need resources. The more resources that folks get that are unencumbered, the more we can pay our teams. Go on social media and share posts and spread the education to your networks, right? Not everyone in your network needs to be connected to DV organization, but you can get that information and education out there by reposting.
In general conversation, I'm a big fan of saying, like, hey, let's pump the brakes on the misogyny, maybe. It takes it's really, it's scary to do at first, but if you are recognizing that there are some like misogynist undertones or overtones to the things that you're hearing with around friends and family, you can, like, one of the most helpful things you can do is just to be like, hey, that's not okay, or like, that's not as funny as you thought it was. Saying that out loud, we're safe. I'm a very big fan of that. Well, thank
I
you.
bet you driving in traffic with you, Mary Beth, is a really positive experience.
It's between the Paul Wellstone quote and like the other things that I like to do while driving, it's less road ragey and more like road transformation, road metamorphosis. But you do what you can. Well, I recognize it's 2:33. We're a little bit behind schedule, but thank you to my three panelists, Amirthini, Keefe, Laura Gapsky, and Scott Miller. Thank you all so much. And yes, go ahead and join DAP for their virtual fundraiser tomorrow night. Any questions and concerns or comments, I know we didn't have time to get to a lot of the questions that were in the chat, but if you have more, you can send them our way. I'm including in this PowerPoint some resources to continue our work together, because this is ongoing, slow Loris work. And we can all do it, but we need the resources. So there are those. I'm going to put real quick a link to the post-webinar survey and a link to our certificate of attendance. Just know that you can download that certificate and fill it in yourselves. You don't need to send us an email. But thank you, Scott, Laura, Amirthini, thank you so much for being here. Everybody else, thank you so much for participating in this conversation with us this afternoon. I am going to stop sharing my screen and stop the recording. But
thanks for bringing us all together. This has been great.
So glad that you all got to be here today. This was like the highlight of my week, I think. All right, thank you all so much.